What's up, yo? Welcome to Your One Life. I'm your host, Kim Young Kim, and I'm super glad to have you as a listener today. If you're new here, here's what this podcast is all about. This podcast is about teaching you from the greatest minds in the world, assisting you in all aspects of your life, and helping you rock your St. Paddy's Day colors like a G by wearing a gold necklace that turns your skin green. Now, today's episode is on Paul Graham's essay, How to Do Great Work, which is an absolute masterpiece. Now, if you don't know who Paul Graham is, he's the inventor of the graham cracker. Whoa, whoa! I think that's my best joke ever. Okay, with all great jokes aside, Paul Graham is the co-founder of Combinator, which is a startup accelerator and venture capital firm that has helped launch a few small companies such as Instacart, Dropbox, DoorDash, Airbnb, Twitch, and Reddit. He's had various accomplishments otherwise, including a PhD in computer science from Harvard University. Now, the way that I'm breaking down this essay in this episode is I picked the advice that I felt like was most universally applicable to most people, and also the parts that were just really, really insightful and good that I just felt like I needed to share. So when you hear the words great work, finding work as great is subjective, but what we're going to do is talk about Paul's definition of great work, which is doing something important so well that you expand people's ideas of what is possible. A few examples of great work in my book are the movie Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and Everything Everywhere All at Once, and the song Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen. Now, not everyone can win Oscars or Grammys or awards for having excellent posture like I have, but everyone has capacity to do great work within the context of their own natural talents. And what Paul Graham, who I'll refer to as PG going forward, states in this essay is to find great work, the work you choose has to have three qualities: something you have a natural aptitude for, something you have a deep interest in, and it offers scope to do great work. And that last part isn't so important, so just focus on your talents and interests. Now, his advice on how to start is, believe it or not, to guess. To pick something and just get going. Now, you may be wrong, and that's okay, because he says there's value in trying something, even if you're wrong in what you choose, and that it's important to know about multiple things, and some of the biggest discoveries come from noticing connections between different fields, like Henry Ford supposedly did, and we're going to get to that later. And what Graham goes on to say is, it's difficult to find your way, and it could take you years before you know how much you like something or how good you are at it. And that's true. I've learned this through my own life. I started a t-shirt biz right out of college and did that for a few years. I spent a few years doing youth motivational speaking, and I even tried my hand at being a tattoo artist. Now, that last one I only did once, and it was a stick and poke tat. And I learned a lot through each experience. Like, don't try your first tattoo on a friend in the jail rec yard who's going to bring up how badly it turned out every single day until one of y'all is released. But real talk, in regards to the time I spent in these ventures, I don't see my time pursuing the t-shirt biz or youth speaking as wasted time, as I learned a lot about life, the world, myself, and I even made some decent money as a youth speaker. But from experience, what I will say is, don't get into something for the wrong reasons. I started a t-shirt biz because I thought I could do it big, blow up, and then have a platform to talk about important life truths because everyone listens to a successful person. And with the youth speaking, I was focused on what I felt like the world needed and what teenagers needed, which is a voice to guide them along their journey, in the same way that I felt a need for one myself in my youth. Now, that was a wrong motivation, even if it was a good one. And what I do now is I use this one particular quote to help guide my efforts. It goes, don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. And that's by Howard Thurman, who was a mentor to Martin Luther King Jr. And this quote and this sentiment aligns very well with Paul Graham's advice. So, how do we start? He says you need to develop a habit of working on your own projects. And the way you choose these is by asking yourself, what's excitingly ambitious? I like that phrase. Excitingly ambitious. Now, what PG says is, if there's one thing you should allow to guide you, let it be curiosity. Because curiosity will be the engine and the rudder of great work. And if you let it have its way, it will drive you and show you what to work on. And that's spot on. Just the other day, my curiosity drove me to tap my neighbor's phone line. Turns out that he is angry at me after all for getting his car wrapped with my podcast logo. He'll get over it though. And speaking of cars, I think that phrase belongs on a bumper sticker. Curiosity, the engine of great work. Now, along the lines of curiosity, one other piece of advice that aligns with Paul Graham's essay is, if there's something that you do that's a valve that you can't turn off, even if you tried, like making music, writing, or coaching people, that's a good sign of what to pursue. For me, myself, I can't stop evangelizing about books that have had a profound impact on my life. And because of that, this podcast and the book promoting that I do feels like a worthy venture, even when it gets hard. So, if someone throws a copy of the book Designing Your Life at you from a moving car like a newspaper delivery man, consider it an act of service and not assault. Now, Paul says these are the 4 steps to great work. First, you choose a field. Then you learn enough to get to one of the frontiers of knowledge in it. Then you notice gaps, and then you explore promising ones. And these are all things to aim for while working. A great example of this is what Whitney Wolfe did after her time at Tinder. She chose a field, which was dating apps, and learned enough to get to the frontier of knowledge in it. And then after facing a toxic work environment, sexual harassment, and seeing that same type of behavior from some of the men on the app, she noticed a gap. So then she sued Tinder and left the company and started a new app, i.e. exploring a promising gap, where women would be the first to initiate and also have more control. And if you've ever been on Bumble, you've seen the end product of her great work. Now, me myself, I don't believe in dating apps. I prefer to meet women through hiking up my pant leg the way God intended. Now, I know that starting a multi-billion-dollar company is a big lift and totally unrelatable, but there are ways to do this on a scale that feels realistic. For example, there are travel companies, some of them being one-person ventures, who cater to solo women travelers, Black women, people over the age of 50, and many other demographics. And what they do is they figure out what the gaps are based on what other companies are missing, and then they fill those gaps. There's an old phrase in the business world that there's riches in the niches, and that's real. And the way you carve out a niche is by seeing where the gaps are and how you can serve the people in those gaps. Now, PG says in the essay that the 3 most powerful motives are curiosity, delight, and the desire to do something impressive. And those 3 motives are the reasons why I decided to try out for Survivor. No, not the TV show, the 80s rock band. And my hope is that they see that I have a third eye of the tiger with a trifecta of curiosity, delight, and the desire to do something impressive. Because what Paul Graham says is, when all 3 converge, it's very powerful. A few other things he has to say about finding great work to do is that a field should be increasingly interesting the more you learn about it, and that you have to find the work sufficiently engaging as it's happening. Now, one thing he says is you have to think about yourself as lucky and not as a victim. Because what he says is, people who have made it big, there's a lot of luck involved. And what you have to do is you have to make yourself a big target for luck. And the way you do this is by being curious, trying lots of things, meeting lots of people, reading lots of books, and asking lots of questions. And I try to do this myself all the time. I've done what's known as informational interviews at random places. For example, the time I met the Strambellas at a rental car agency in LA, and I had no idea who they were, but they had instruments and they were clearly in a band. So I had a lot of questions about what it's like to be in a traveling band, and I learned that day how hard it is to be a professional musician and the reality of it all. And it came to no surprise to me when Simon Ward, the lead singer and the main guy I was talking to, quit the band to spend time with his family. And that day, as I bid Simon adieu and said, "Hey, it's really nice to meet you," he actually said to me, "Wow, you are not the typical conversation I have at all with people." And that's right, because what I was doing is I was collecting intel to see if being a traveling performing artist was right for me. Now, PG says, go hang out where the people you want to learn from hang out, preferably in person, right? Because oftentimes what they'll do is they'll share their knowledge with you. One way I know of is to go to conferences. Now, if you can't afford to go to a conference, you can always volunteer at them. I know people who have volunteered at film festivals and conferences to get their foot in the door into these worlds. And that's what you got to do too. You got to hang where the people are congregating in one particular place, whether that's conferences, comedy clubs, the prison rec yard. Go wherever they are and ask them questions. And if this doesn't work for you because you're painfully shy or don't leave the house much, you can actually learn a lot about work you're interested in from reading. Now, when it comes to what you should make, what PG says is to make what people want. Well, how do you find that? He says the best way is to make what you want. And that's spot on. I love writing jokes, and even if no one finds them funny, which almost never happens, my jokes always make me laugh, and sometimes they make the people in HR frown. But that doesn't matter because my laughter is the reward in and of itself. And as I was creating this podcast and I was thinking about what to make and how to make it, I told myself what I need is a podcast where I laugh and I learn. So I made a podcast that suits my fancy and the art I like to consume and also is fully me. So go and make what you like. Now, PG's advice on what to work on is, he says, find excitingly ambitious projects. But he also says, work on what gives you the best options for the future. Now, I have a good friend who was making a few pieces of his own custom furniture, and he was actually quite good at it. And it was something that he was thinking about pursuing. But as he started making stuff, he realized he can't turn this into a sustainable business with the amount of work he'd have to do and the amount of money he could get paid for each piece of furniture. So what he did is he kept doing his day job, and also I'm sure he's figuring other things out. And here's the thing, some things can just be hobbies. That's A-okay. Now, when it comes to the actual work sessions that you get into, Paul Graham says to lay aside big blocks of time to work on your projects. And I'm assuming he means 2 or 3 hours plus, but he also says that some work you can't sustain for more than 4 or 5 hours a day because of the mental energy it takes, and there's diminishing returns sometimes when you work too many hours. So make sure to tell that to your boss next time he asks you to stay late at Joann's Fabric. Now, here's PG's tip on overcoming inertia. And you probably already know this reality, which is it's harder to start on work than to keep working once you get going. So he says you have to trick yourself by saying you'll do just a little bit of work. This is known as a tiny habit. So he says to himself, what I'll do is I'll just read over what I've got so far and leave it at that. And next thing you know, he's typing away and writing something brand new. And I do this sort of thing all the time. I go to my pull-up bar and I say to myself, I'll just start with 1,000 pull-ups. And after I get my warm-up set in, next thing you know, Guinness Book records are being broken. Now, another hack he suggests using is asking the question, how hard can it be? He says a lot of projects start off with people asking the question, how hard could it be? But also he says you got to lie to yourself about the importance of your work. And I do this all the time. Right before I start working on my podcast, I tell myself that one of my listeners is on the verge of becoming a crypto bro. And my next episode is going to save him from that life. Is that true? Who cares? It gets me to do the work. So figure out how you can lie to yourself as well so you can get it done. Now, when he talks about procrastinating, he says, yes, we are drawn to procrastinate, but don't procrastinate in years because then you'll lose years. I did this myself with you speaking. I actually started many years after I had the initial idea, which reminds me of a quote I've seen, which is, one day or day one, you decide. Now, regarding your work habits, he says, finish what you start, because a lot of the best work happens in what was meant to be the final stage. And that's spot on. Imagine quitting on a spaghetti recipe before the end and missing out on the last step of sprinkling Parmesan fairy dust on top. Another argument for finishing what you start on is this. He says the trouble with exponential growth is that the curve feels flat in the beginning. And that's true. Most people who do something big don't see any inspiring results until years in. Think about this. It took Keith Urban 14 years to become an overnight success. And all the while he was playing in bars and in small venues until he dropped that one album that hit. But here's the deal. When he hit, man, did he hit. And even with investing, this rings true. If you look at Warren Buffett's net worth, it's pretty flat for the first 40 years of his adult life. And his money really only takes off when he's in his mid-60s. And he's one of the GOAT investors. And speaking of GOATs, another piece of advice he gives is to see who is doing the best work in your field and to have good taste so you know what the best work is and why it's the best so that you have something to aim for. And I couldn't agree more. Like, if you're making science videos for kids and you're not watching Bill Nye, what are you even doing? You have to have good taste and you have to steal like an artist. And he goes on to say, you got to aim high. You got to try to be the best. And if you don't try to be the best, you won't even be good. And that's what you got to do. Is you got to try to be the best. Try to be the wolf from Pulp Fiction. Try to be one of one. Try to be like Mike. And that's what Kobe Bryant did. And look at his storied career. Also, when you try to be the best, it helps you live your life with no regrets. And as you create, he says, be optimistic, even if you look like a fool. And I've done this recently. I actually made a 4-part series on the book, The Almanac of Naval Ravikant, which I'm very proud of. But to promote the series, I had a photo of Naval's face printed on a shirt with his website above it. And my thought was it would be a hit and people would love it, but it wasn't, and they didn't. Nobody actually understood it was an actual famous person on my shirt. They thought it was some Indian friend of mine. And even those who didn't think it was clever and cool, and it was a total miss. But that's okay, because sometimes you miss, but you got to take the shot if it seems right. And also, I still like the idea regardless of what people say. Now, regarding the work you make, one thing PG says is, don't hold your work to be precious and be willing to kill your darlings. Now, there are things that you love and you want to keep in your projects and also your work that don't quite fit. And if they don't fit, you got to kill them off. Now, I learned this lesson myself when I got hydraulics installed on my Honda Fit. And I did it because I thought it was cool and I hoped my dates would be impressed. But instead, they kept pulling the seat ejection lever and blasting through my sunroof, which was their subtle way of telling me they weren't impressed. Lesson learned. But jokes aside, just because something is clever and good doesn't mean it fits with the project. And this is a lesson that was taught to me in my creative writing class in college, which was to kill your darlings if they don't support the overall work. Now, to make great work, one thing PG says is you got to change your context and you need to go to a new place, even if it's just going on a walk. But also you should travel the world. Maybe you go to Paris. Maybe you visit all the sites, including the Louvre. If you do, just make sure you leave the museum with new ideas and not actual physical art. Now, changing your context is important, but it's even more important to change your paradigm and to change your thinking. And what PG says is we see the world through models, and these models both help us and also constrain us. One model that's out there is that hard work and determination lead to success. And that is a big part of it, but there's also ways to do more without doing more. I've been reading a book called 10x is Easier Than 2x by Dan Sullivan and Benjamin Hardy, and it shows that the whole idea of grinding your way to success isn't necessarily needed in the way that it's romanticized, and how going 10x is actually easier than 2x. And one way you can go 10x over 2x is by focusing on the few activities that actually make a difference in your business, in your work, etc. I highly recommend this book and the other two books they wrote as a team, and I will tag this book in the show notes. Now, to make great work, one thing he says is you got to break rules or don't care about them. I remember watching the video where Lin-Manuel Miranda was at the White House in 2009, and he performed a hip-hop song about Alexander Hamilton, just as he was starting to prototype the Hamilton musical. And they laughed at him. Why? Because he didn't care about the rules of what's cool. He was just making something that spoke to his heart. My question for you is, who's laughing now? Now, in regards to making great work, he says questions are key. And he says big ideas aren't answers, but questions. Big questions, like how do new species arise? Or how do planets stay afloat in orbit? Or how do we keep getting commercials with DJ Khaled in them? Like seriously, who's hiring this guy? But real talk, questions are oftentimes big ideas and great work. And they're what help people discover cures for diseases, different planets and galaxies, and basically all of our technological advances. So make sure to seek out questions. Now, PG says, as you're seeking out questions, confusion is actually good. Confusion is actually a sign that you can have a breakthrough. And that puzzles are oftentimes good because they lead to discoveries. Now, to do great work, PG says, what you got to do is you got to be promiscuously curious, which is a great phrase. He says you got to pull on a lot of threads, try stuff, and see what happens. And that big things oftentimes start off really small. Now, I recently listened to a book called Tiny Experiments by Anne-Laure Lecomte, and it's a book about doing just that. It gives great advice on being promiscuously curious, and I highly recommend it. I'll tag it in the show notes. Now, PG says, as you're pulling out a lot of threads, you got to try stuff because trying stuff is actually fun, and you actually learn a lot faster when you try stuff. And he says the more you try, the more likely you are to find something new, but also most of it will be failure, but not actual failure because, as a wise person once said, sometimes you win, sometimes you learn. And that's all failure is. A good example of this is bad dates, because bad dates are a learning experience. I don't go on dates with crazy women on purpose, but when I do, I learn a lot about myself and also people in general. And as a bonus, I get great comedy material. And I should probably stop taking notes during these bad dates, but I won't. Now, as you try stuff, what he says is you should get an initial version in front of people, often known as a MVP or minimum viable product, and then iterate on it based on feedback. Because the way great work and great products are developed is through lots and lots of iterations based on feedback. Any TV show, any book, or any other piece of art that you like, and all the products that you use went through lots of iterations before they became what they are. and they did so through feedback. And the thing about it is, what you create will evolve into maybe something completely different than what you started off with. For example, did you know the original purpose of the stun gun was to heat up food? And for me, I still use mine to make my chicken nuggets extra crisp because I'm all about that life. But real talk, most things are very different from what the creator was originally aiming for. And that's totally cool because oftentimes what it ends up becoming is way bigger and cooler than what the person originally had in mind. Now, regarding making great work, he says you got to take some risks. He says you got to take as much risk as you can afford. And if you're not failing occasionally, you're probably being too conservative. Yeah, taking risks is fundamental to being successful. Nobody makes anything of themselves in life without taking risks, without failing some. And the thing about it is, through failure, you learn a lot. And even through failed projects, you learn a lot. So they're definitely not wasted because you learn a lot about business, life, and yourself. And through trying something that's too hard, you get a great source of questions, which I've already communicated why those are so important. Now, as you do your great work, Paul Graham says, focus on your great work and don't be focused on chasing influential people. And I've been guilty of this in the past. And one of the main problems I see with this mentality of chasing success through others is this. Once you get in front of the influential person, you still have to deliver the goods. And therefore, excellence is the best strategy. A great example of this is when Fat Joe met the legendary rapper Big Pun. Now, this is pre-Ozempic Fat Joe, who realized he had to sign a guy who was also Latino and also quite obese. And Big Pun was really obese. He was like pushing 600 pounds. So Fat Joe knew that they were going to tell hella jokes about them. He was probably thinking, they're going to call us fat and fatter. But Fat Joe knew that if he doesn't sign Big Pun, someone else would, and they get rich because Pun had bars. So that's what you got to do to develop yourself and be so good they can't ignore you and do great work. Now, as you are creating, Paul Graham says, copy from other fields like Henry Ford. Now, the real story behind Henry Ford and the assembly line is this. One of his managers actually found the assembly line system at a slaughterhouse. That's right, it wasn't even Ford himself, it was one of his cronies. And that employee said, hey, assembly lines, let's implement this, right? And they did, and it revolutionized car creation. Now, full respect to Henry Ford, full respect. But like most business people, he was great because he surrounded himself with great people. And speaking of great people, PG says, seek out the best colleagues to collaborate with and bounce ideas off. And work with people you want to become like, because you will. And he even says that evidence hints that colleagues can actually make the difference between great work and not great work. And that is spot on. Like, nobody creates anything just in their own mind, out of their own greatness. Everybody has some help, and having colleagues that sharpen you and you sharpen in return and so on and so forth, that's what's going to help make you great. Now, in regards to becoming great, he also says, protect your morale, to protect and conserve your energy and your spirits, because what high morale does is it helps you do good work, and then it becomes this virtuous cycle. And so what you got to do is you got to create boundaries from family and friends in your life that want to crap on your dreams, on people who, denigrate your work and so on and so forth. I remember hearing the story about Lady Gaga, who actually had a Facebook group in college that was titled, Stephanie Germanata, You Will Never Be Famous. Hopefully she was able to block that noise out, because even some of the biggest stars say, don't read the paper. Like, I remember listening to an interview with Kate McKinnon, who is a former SNL legend, absolutely wonderful and so talented. And she even said, don't read the paper. Like they're going to say bad things about you in the newspaper. Don't read it. Unless you need it for motivation. But I don't know. That's a slippery slope right there, right? But at the end of the day, make sure that you protect your morale and your spirits and your energy. And as you protect your morale, Paul Graham says one of the biggest mistakes is allowing a setback to destroy morale all at once, like a balloon bursting. Now, here's the deal. Setbacks are a part of life. Imagine if Thomas Edison, when his research lab in Menlo Park went up in flames, and he gave up inventing because he lost all those inventions he stole from Nikola Tesla. He didn't quit due to the fire, so neither should you. But PG does argue that quitting isn't always bad. Sometimes quitting is a move. For example, did you know Christopher Walken spent time as a lion tamer before he became an actor? Now, if he hadn't quit that job, we would have never experienced his glorious presence on the big screen. But the big thing Paul Graham is saying is don't quit because something bad happened. Don't quit because you had a setback. And regardless of what you do, he says it's important to go back to the root node or the foundational node, the main thing. And for Christopher Walken, I think his root node is performance and more cowbell. Now, something I found surprising that Paul Graham said is if a handful of people like what you do, that's enough. You don't need a big audience, particularly at first. And this reminds me of Kevin Kelly's idea of 1,000 true fans. The premise of the idea is if 1,000 people adore what you do and are willing to give you about $100 a year, you have a business that's $100,000 and a career. And when you put it like that, it's not as hard to do. So it's not about the size of your fans, but about the loyalty. But if you can get a huge fan base, go for it, right? And PG says it's okay to go for things. It's okay to want to impress people, but choose the right ones to impress. For example, I'm trying to impress attractive women. But what I think Paul is saying is this. You don't want to be Florida Georgia Line. You want to be Damian Rice. You want to impress people who have good taste and not the masses. Now, if the masses love your stuff, there's nothing wrong with that. But make sure it's because what you're doing is great, not because you're pandering to them. And he also says, don't chase something just because other people are. For example, if you're making reaction videos where you steal the whole video and don't add anything original besides a head nod and some facial expressions, why are you even doing that? That actually reminds me of the one scene in Billy Madison where Adam Sandler convinces all the kids that peeing in their pants is cool. You don't want to be one of those kids walking around with a wet crotch thinking you're Miles Davis. So don't chase things because it's popular or trending. Chase it because it aligns with who you are and it's actual great work. And the note that Paul Graham ends on is this. Many more people could try to do great work than do. And the things that hold us back are modesty and fear. And he says that this is not a conscious decision, but it's in your subconscious. And subconsciously, you might have a lot of fear that's holding you back. Or you may be asking yourself this question, who am I to be great? And my answer is, who are you not to be? Now, a few days ago, I was having breakfast with another creator, and that's something that came up from me, that I'm going to do all I can and go after big things. If I come up short, that's fine. If I don't make great things happen, that's fine. I just don't want to not try because of my fear of failure. And I won't sit here and say I don't struggle at all, because I do. I struggle with these fears and these questions as well. But also, I know it's all about living with no regrets. And the biggest regret people have when they're in a nursing home late in life is the stuff they didn't do. Here's a Teddy Roosevelt quote that I love on this topic. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred with dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. These are such inspiring words and words of how I want to live. And I believe you do too, or you wouldn't even be listening to this podcast. So, now that you have instructions on how to do great work, it's time that you implement and start working on something that's excitingly ambitious. My question to you is, one day or day one? You decide. All right, so that's the end of the episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got a lot out of it. And I hope you implement the great learnings from this essay. Go out and read it on your own. It's not very long. It's free online. I'll tag a link in the show notes. And also consider revisiting this episode in the future when you need some guidance on how to do great work. Now, if you're new here, don't forget to hit the follow button so you don't miss future episodes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone who needs to hear this message. And if you would share it through your socials the way you share other podcasts, I'd really appreciate it. I want to give a shout out to my dude Siraj Rhett, who made the instrumental for this podcast. And also shout out to Paul Graham for this amazing essay. And shout out to you for the great things you're going to do with this valuable knowledge. All right, so that's all I got for now. This is Your One Life. I'm Kim Young Kim. I hope you have a great day, a great week, and until next time, peace!